Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining. I hope that you are going to learn a lot and find it really interesting and exciting.
Yes.
Thank you for having me.
Yes. So please continue to introduce yourselves in the chat box. Let us know your names and where you're tuning in from. Before we start, let all of us join at Kahoot. It's a small introduction. You just need to know how much you know about this field. So just log in at www.kahoot.it.
In Kahoot, time also matters for points. So the quicker you answer, the more points you get.
All right,
So,
we have one answer.
sorry, Nick. So yeah, 67% of the African population, about more than 800 million people on the continent, use forest products either for subsistence, so for food or firewood, or cash income for livelihoods. So that is a huge number. I thought that might fool everyone because Ghana is very well known for their shea nuts, but actually it's Nigeria who is the largest producer and exporter of shea nuts.
Yeah, I think I would have gone for Ghana myself.
Is in fact 8.8 million in 2019. And what's interesting about that is that it's actually 60% of the revenue for Ottawa. So as much as hunting is, being given a lot of trouble at the moment in the press and the media, it does play an incredibly important role in conservation in areas where there are no alternative sources of revenue. And so 60% of the revenue for the Wildlife Authority, who manages conservation in Tanzania, their revenue comes from hunting. Again, I thought people would say Egypt because I'm sure a lot of you were thinking of frankincense, but do any of you know which oil this is, the name of this oil in Morocco? It is a tree that is endemic to Morocco, the only place in the world that this tree is found. If you want to put in the chat if you have an idea. But the oil is used in a lot of cosmetics and shampoos and hair conditioners. It's called argan oil. You often see it also called Moroccan oil, but it is actually argan oil. So the argan tree, and it is the most expensive edible oil in the world. Is in fact a very small number, 5%, which for me as an economist illustrates that we have huge potential for growth in Africa. We only receive 5% of all global tourism arrivals, so there's big potential for us. Well done, 56 million annually. And so the point here is that a lot of people think of South Africa as a big hunting destination, but most of the hunting in South Africa is for meat, for the consumption of meat, for venison, for local consumption. Well done. Those were really random questions from all over the wildlife economy, but I thought we just started with some interesting facts. So what we're going to be looking at today is the wildlife economy in Africa and unlocking its potential. And how do educators, what is your role in this? How do we bring students into it? And why is it important at all? So our mission at the School of Wildlife Conservation is just, I wanted to give the overview of that, is to become leaders in promoting, supporting and facilitating policy and practice relevant research on the business of conservation in Africa. So although we call the School of Wildlife Conservation, we don't look at ecological or biodiversity conservation per se, we look at the business of conservation. So how do we make money from conservation for Africa? To align conservation and development. And the research that we do is all policy and practice relevant. We don't want to do research for just to write reports. We do want to have an impact on conservation and development in Africa. And then just before we talk more about this wildlife economy, what is it and how are we defining it? So I think it's important that we're all on the same page. There are a number of different definitions of the wildlife economy. The one we use at the School of Wildlife Conservation is that the wildlife economy uses indigenous wildlife, plants and animals, marine, aquatic and terrestrial, as an economic asset to create value that aligns with conservation objectives and delivers sustainable growth and economic development. So the key things there are, although we use the term wildlife, and a lot of people think of wildlife as big four-legged hairy creatures, our wildlife includes fauna and flora, and both in the ocean, in rivers, dams, lakes, as well as on land, and literally from mushrooms and all fungi all the way to whales and elephants, so, and everything in between. So all fauna and flora. And the activities we look at must align with conservation objectives, and they must deliver economic development. So we're really trying to illustrate that conservation and development are not mutually exclusive. You often find people who are either conservationists or development economists or development specialists, and they separate them and don't ever bring them together. And we are trying to show through the wildlife economy that they are very much can be combined. And I'll show you a graph a bit later that shows the impact that this can have on Africa and our development. And so, for example, we don't look at things like commercial fisheries because they largely don't align with conservation objectives. As I'm sure some of you are familiar, those big trawlers that fish in the ocean often destroy coral reefs. They take up turtles, they take up dolphins, a lot of bycatch. And so we don't look at those activities. We really want to make sure this conservation development alignment is happening. And this very busy picture is just to give context, because I think a lot more people have heard of natural capital accounting, which has become a real buzzword in Africa. And where does that fit? So we work a lot with the governments in Africa, and they always, yeah, but we're looking at natural capital accounting. So why do we need to know what's happening in the wildlife economy? So essentially, countries have a stock of fauna and flora. And how big is the stock and what is it worth is measured by natural capital accounting, also by a program called WAVES, which is wealth accounting and the valuation of ecosystem services. And how that stock is used is the flow, and that is the wildlife economy. And how is the stock being used and what is the value of the activities using that stock is things like tourism satellite accounts and then wildlife economy case studies. And you have people who are using the stock, and then you have people who are involved in the flow in the activities. And then the United Nations have a new system of environmental economic accounting, SEER, which is trying to bring the two together, the stock and the flow. Natural capital accounting does also look a bit at the flow, but it focuses mostly on the stock. And what we refer to as the asset, because essentially the stock that you have of your fauna and flora is the asset that the country has now to develop and grow. And so in terms of students trying to understand this, it's very important that we contextualize where each element of this fits in, and that each is important in its own right. It's not a duplication of efforts. It's really trying to understand the whole picture of conservation in Africa and then how it relates to development. Because as we know, Africa is full of mostly developing countries or underdeveloped countries. And so we need to figure out a way that Africa can develop that aligns with conservation objectives. So again, just to define the main wildlife economy activities, we have classified into what we call the big 5 wildlife economy activities. And any of you who are nature tourists will know, obviously, it's a play on the big 5 animals. The first one we look at is ecotourism, which includes non-consumptive tourism related to nature or wildlife. And the reason we put the word non-consumptive in there is because the traditional definition of ecotourism includes hunting. But we have separated hunting out into its own category because of obviously a lot of the controversy around it, but also trying to understand its value separated from the non-consumptive. So hunting includes trophy hunting, game meat hunting, as well as some aspects of fishing, such as artisanal, small scale, and recreational. And a lot of people always say to us, why is fishing under hunting? Essentially, fishing is the hunting of fish. And it's fascinating that a country like Kenya has banned all forms of terrestrial hunting, but you can fish in Kenya, and you can do recreational fishing in Kenya, and you can do small scale and artisanal fishing. So you're allowed to fish, you're allowed to hunt fish, but not anything terrestrial. And so a lot of countries now are trying to understand all of this and their legislation and how it allows different elements of the wildlife economy. And then you have wildlife ranching, which includes the breeding of wild or indigenous animals for hunting, game, meat products, and other uses. And I forgot to emphasize in the definition that we look only at indigenous wildlife, fauna and flora, because we obviously, again, trying to align with those conservation objectives. And this is something that is really growing in Africa. In 2021, Rwanda passed the Biodiversity Act, which allows for the ownership of wildlife. And so people can actually breed and earn income from wildlife in Rwanda now, which is a very new development in Rwanda. A lot of Southern African countries already allow this. Tanzania has always allowed it, but never really promoted it, and they are really trying to promote it. So again, it's important to understand that how this fits in and how it can be sustainable in the long run. And then the carbon market, also a very growing big sector, includes projects that earn income through RED, which is the reduced emissions from deforestation and degradation, a very complicated way of just saying it sequesters and stores carbon, and you can earn revenues from it. And then other consumptive use, which includes forest products that are used commercially or for subsistence. And for me, this has been amazing insight. My background is all in tourism, in high-end ecotourism and protected areas. And when I started this research 3 years ago, I was just blown away by forest products and how, as you saw earlier, 67% of African population relies on the forest. And by forest products, we don't only mean in Congo Basin forests, anything from the savannah as well. So marula fruits, baobab, mapani worms. So it includes edible insects, edible plants, medicinal plants, or anything that you can either eat or sell from nature, not necessarily forest, but they are just the term is forest products. So what is the state of the wildlife economy in Africa, you may ask? And as an economist, I was very excited to start this research until I realized that there is very little data available, and it is not something a statistician wants to see here, but the data is largely not comparable, it's inconsistent, a lot of it's very old. And so as educators and people training students for the future, this gathering of data for policy and practice is so critical, because as you'll see in the next slide, you cannot manage what you don't measure. And right now we have no idea what the value of the wildlife economy is, or what the value of the activities are, how much people are depending on nature. And so how can we manage it if we don't understand it at all in any way? And so it really is critical that we understand it so that we can manage it more sustainably for the future. This is a little graphic that I like to show, and also run through it with the students, is the difference between raw data and the stories they can tell. So you have all this data mixed up, and then you sort it nicely, then you arrange it into pretty graphs, and then you present it very nicely. But if you take all of that and you put it into a story, I'm sure when you look back in 5 minutes time, you will remember the house. You're not going to remember that scramble of data. And so when we work with the students, always tell them that there's no point in collecting data if you can't tell a story with it and communicate the results in a way that can have impact. And so that is something that we very much try and do with our research, is have that impact through stories. And so for that reason, we've done case studies. So we published the State of the Wildlife Economy in Africa report in 2021, which is about 400 pages. And it covers those 5 wildlife economy activities across Africa. And then we realized this lack of data, that it wasn't going to be possible to do a continent-wide study. And so we focused then on country case studies. So the full report includes 5 case studies, which I'll show you now. And then we did a roadmap, which is essentially a summary. It's about 40, 50 pages, summarizing the big report, again, realizing that people don't necessarily want to read 400 pages, but we wanted to get the message out. And again, that's something we reiterate with the students, is that you want to make your message clear to have the impact. So we've done case studies on Gabon, Rwanda, Ghana, Kenya, South Africa, Uganda, Tanzania. We also did a policy brief for the Ugandan government. We worked very closely with the Ugandan Wildlife Authority on that project. Same in Zambia, we worked with the Department of National Parks and Wildlife, and we did a policy brief for them as well. And then we've also done Nigeria, Benin, and Senegal. And so the aim is to do a case study for every country in Africa to get that measurement so that we can manage it better. And we try and work as closely as possible with government so that they can understand it. And it was really amazing working with the Ugandan government, because often, and not only them, people in government see wildlife, the value of it is tourism. And so they count how many people are coming to their parks. Often they don't even know the value of that, they just know the number. And that doesn't help you manage it. And when we showed them all the forest products, for example, in Uganda, longhorn grasshoppers supply protein and live and money income to thousands of households every season when the longhorn grasshoppers come through. And so that is food that people wouldn't have if there weren't longhorn grasshoppers. The same with medicinal plants. When we show them how much people are using from the forest, healthcare systems would be put under such pressure if we didn't have these medicinal plants. And so we need to understand this whole picture. And so there's so many different aspects, and I get so excited about it because for students, the wildlife economy really covers everything. And so getting them involved and engaged in opportunities to unlock it and to research, to measure it. So how we engage students specifically, we use knowledge products. So the reports we write are used in classes for discussion and increasing knowledge. So through case study examples. So we make them work through the case studies and answer questions on it. We also, as a research team, always have interns working with us, and they also engage in external stakeholder workshops. So we, as part of the development of our case studies, we work, as I said, with government, but also other stakeholders. And the interns always join those calls as observers to see how we take research into policy and practice, and how do you engage stakeholders, because it really is a multi-sectoral sector, the wildlife economy, and we have to have collaboration and partnerships. Then we involve them in field research as and where we are collecting data, and then we also advise them on their projects. And a lot of this is related to the gaps. So I've identified so many gaps in the data in all spheres of the wildlife economy. And so supporting them to choose a topic that needs to be researched, that they would have an impact, and that is important data. And that's where, as educators, we'd love to work with others who are working in this space, because we just as an institute can't do all this research. And so, identifying gaps and sharing it and collaborating and working with it. As part of that, I'm actually the chair of the African Wildlife Economy Community of Practice. And in that community of practice, we are trying to see how we can fill all these gaps. And so happy to chat to anyone who's interested in that. So then I just wanted to share with you some facts and figures on the wildlife economy in Africa. There are a mix and match from the different wildlife economy activities, but I just out of interest, and obviously the scale of them is massive. And this is remembering that this is based on a lot of not consistent data, not very up-to-date data. And so imagine if we could collect consistent comparable data, what we could show. So the wildlife safari industry in Africa is estimated at between 12.4 and 42.9 billion. So that is, in economic terms, the total cost includes induced, indirect, and impacts. And that is so important in the wildlife economy, the value chains or multipliers that go beyond just the activity. So in tourism, you've got food, accommodation, transport, flights, all of that is over and above the actual activity. And then in Uganda, the gorilla sale permit sales earned approximately 26 million in the 2018-19 financial year, and about 10 million has been shared with the local communities through the tourism revenue sharing scheme. And Tanzania, which has the 8th largest tourism economy in Africa, 78% of tourists visit national parks. Just highlighting the critical importance of maintaining the conservation objectives, because 1.2 million tourists would not come to Tanzania if they didn't look after their natural resources, and if they don't, which it's critically important. And then in Rwanda, who also has a tourism revenue sharing program, in 2019, 2.8 million was shared with local communities. So Rwanda shares 10% of all park revenue with the communities. A critical element of the wildlife economy is this benefit sharing to those who are living with wildlife and bearing the costs of it. And in Nigeria, a study showed that if the tourism industry was supported, it could generate up to 10 billion annually by 2030. It is very underdeveloped in Nigeria. Then in terms of ranching, Namibia, approximately 23.7 million is generated through sale of game meat. You can see it's about half of South Africa. It is a much less populated country and much less developed wildlife ranching sector. And another study showed that where farmers combined livestock or agriculture with wildlife, they boosted their income by 23%. So that's nearly a quarter, which is massive. And what I'd like to illustrate here is that often, I said earlier that there's this conservation and development that are separated, and often agriculture and conservation are separated, but mixed land use can boost income. It can also, bringing wildlife into a previous livestock area can increase the carbon store in the soil, which can then earn revenue through the carbon market. So we need to look at all these different aspects and understand them. And then recent estimates showed that approximately 500,000 tons of bushmeat, which is illegal, valued at about 20.7 million, is consumed annually in Nigeria. So this is an opportunity for wildlife ranching. And that is something that, as I said, a lot of countries are looking at now, because when COVID hit and tourism collapsed and there was no revenue for conservation or how to conserve, wildlife ranching was a very sustainable option in the countries where it was happening. And so supplying legal game or bushmeat or wild meat could help stop this illegal bushmeat or poaching that is happening if you can provide legal meat. There's a great example in Zambia. They have a campaign called "This Is Not a Game," and there are adverts everywhere around Lusaka and around the country where encouraging people to only buy legal game meat because they have a big wildlife ranching industry. And so you're asked to question where the meat is coming from. Again, it's about zoonotic diseases and not spreading disease, but mostly about promoting legal trade. And then hunting in Cameroon, sport hunting generated 1.2 million in northern Cameroon. And the point here is that, yes, hunting is controversial and we would love to not have hunting because of the perception of it. But in a small country like Cameroon, in the northern Cameroon, eco-tourists are not going to visit. And so hunting provides 1.2 million for the conservation of that area. And until we can find alternatives, it is a very good option for conservation and keeping land protected or under conservation. And in Uganda, hunting generates about almost $1 million every year. And Namibia non-consumptive tourism induced by trophy hunters is approximately 4.5 million in 2016. And the point there is that this is family or friends traveling with a trophy hunter who then do other tourism, and also the accommodation that I mentioned, the food, all the other tourism around the hunt. So it's not always about the hunt. The same in South Africa, between 60 and 70% of the hunting sector's value is from ancillary goods and services. So things like taxidermy, gun permits, transport, accommodation. So yeah, it's always, we mustn't, as the saying goes, throw the baby out with the bath water until we can find alternative ways to generate revenue for conservation. And then fisheries, recreational fisheries in Mozambique, up to 1 million per annum. And aquaculture is something we also look at, which could be a sustainable option, especially in West Africa, where the population depends heavily on fish for protein. Uganda is the largest aquaculture producer after Nigeria, which accounts for 52% of annual production. And this could be the same as the wildlife ranching can provide meat to substitute for the illegal trade. Aquaculture can supply fish. Many countries in Africa are importing fish because of demand. So there's this opportunity to create a local economy. And then recreational fisheries in 11 West African countries, the economic contribution is 152 million every year, with 12 million people employed. And interestingly, there 58% are in fishing, which is mostly men, and 42% in the processing sector, which is women. So fisheries really helps with gender balance in terms of employment. And then carbon is seriously untapped, but has great potential. And it can earn revenues to support conservation. There's a project in Zambia that has earned approximately 4.5 million to 13 communities in the Luangwa Valley. And so again, this provides a tangible benefit and an incentive to conserve areas for people living in those areas. And in Uganda, Eco Trust, with 1,500 farmers, has generated 1 million tons of carbon with 6 million. Carbon Tanzania, another project, almost 500,000. And then we must never forget the mangroves and blue carbon. There's Makoko Pamoja in Kenya that has paid 76,000 to communities. So what I'm trying to illustrate here as well is the diversity of activities that you can have at the same time. So a mangrove blue carbon project, you can have subsistence or recreational fishing, as well as ecotourism, all at the same time, as well as some seaweed farming along in the coast as a forest product. And so this diversification reduces risk and builds resilience for local communities and governments and the private sector. So as I mentioned in the Kahoot, 67% of the African population uses non-timber forest products. But what is really sad is it's not prioritized in policymaking or government funding and not included in official reporting. So there is no understanding whatsoever of the value. So I did some research in Zambia around Moso-Otunya National Park, and I asked the communities there what they were collecting from the forest. And they told me mushrooms, herbs, firewood. And I said, so how much is that? What is the value of that? And they're like, no, it's free. We just go into the forest and we collect it. I'm like, no, I know it's free. But if the forest was destroyed and you had to pay for that, what is the value of it? And we worked out, they did some costing from the market, and it came up to about 23% of their annual household income they are collecting for free from the forest. So understanding that value and government understanding that, the protection of that forest is critical to already critically poor households who then would have to rely on earning an extra 23% somehow to feed themselves, to provide fuel. And so we really do need to understand this value. In South Africa, aloe ferox, I'm sure many of you have heard of, exports 154 million over a 9-year period. And then that argan oil that I mentioned earns approximately 32 million annually in Morocco and supports about 2 million people. So a massive industry in Morocco. And then Nigeria produces 70% of the world's cola nuts, about 141 million annually. For those who are not familiar with cola nuts, they are essentially, the easiest way to describe it, the Red Bull of West Africa. They are caffeinated and they're often given out at weddings and celebrations. Very, very popular in West Africa. And then my favorite, Ethiopian coffee. Arabica coffee is indigenous to Ethiopia, and they are the 5th largest producer in the world, about 5% of GDP, employing 4 million smallholders and 15 million people, 15% of the whole population at different points in the value chain. Again, remembering the importance of those multipliers. And then in Zambia, approximately 135.8 million non-timber forest products every year. So these are just some values just to show you how important this is from an economic development point of view and how untapped it is from a research point of view, from an employment point of view, the need for entrepreneurs and so students who are encouraged to unlock these opportunities. So we have the stock that I mentioned in the middle, and then you have all these activities around. I didn't mention film and photography or wildlife estates, which are also starting to grow. Wildlife estates are essentially where someone is given a plot of land in a conservation area and they can build a house. They are becoming very popular now post-COVID because people can work from home. So people want to get out of the cities and live in nature. And then we've got this yellow ball of not yet utilized, so the potential. And it can either be dispersed amongst those different activities, maybe they're new activities. And that's what we need to figure out is how do we unlock this and how do we grow this wildlife economy? And so what is needed? During our research, we identified 5 steps that are critical at a national level and a local level. The first one is legislation and policy and regulatory frameworks. People have to have the right to own land and or resources to benefit from them. Otherwise, there will be no incentive to invest in them or conserve them. For example, Kenya, I'm sure, as I mentioned earlier, they don't allow terrestrial hunting, which they banned in 1970, I think, or 79. Since 1970, since then, they've lost 60% of their wildlife because there is no value to people because they can't own it, they can't sell it, they can't utilize it. So they have no incentive to conserve it. So we need to get this legislation right. And that's where we also need to encourage people and students to go into government to be able to be the ambassadors for this sector. Then we need to improve the environment for the private sector to invest. as I said earlier, promote collaboration and partnerships because it is multi-sectoral. Finance, conservation, water, forests, tourism, all these ministries are part of the wildlife economy. And then you've got private sector, NGOs, government, communities that all need to work together. And then that you can't manage what you don't measure, improve transparency and data collection so that we can understand what we are working with, and then build capacity to engage in and manage. Our experience is that, as I said, everyone is familiar with ecotourism, but they don't understand all these other different aspects and nuances of the wildlife economy where there are so many opportunities. So why does any of this matter? Why have you sat for 40 minutes or 30 minutes listening to any of this? This is a graph from the Economics of Biodiversity report by Sir Partha Dasgupta in 2021. And he showed that globally, since 1992, natural capital has consistently declined and produced and human capital have grown. And so as a School of Wildlife Conservation, we believe that Africa can develop differently, that through the wildlife economy, we can grow natural capital at the same time as produced and human capital by combining this conservation and development. And we won't need to be looking like Europe, like the USA, at rewilding in 30 years. Because of that decline in natural capital, the other continents now have no fauna and flora. And so they are scrambling now to rewild. And we don't want to be like that. We want to be able to maintain and grow all our capitals. Similarly, there are many benefits, employment, revenues from conservation, but there are also costs. So this photo I took in South Luangwe when I was doing my PhD research, and it's an elephant coming to eat the mangoes in this village. It is a serious cost to communities, having wildlife come into their villages, human life loss, crops lost, livestock lost. And so we have to ensure net benefits. And the wildlife economy can tip that scale to make the benefits a lot more than the costs. So overall, the wildlife economy is a key growth opportunity for Africa because we have a comparative advantage. As a continent, we have more megafauna or big animals than any other continent. We also have more diversity of wildlife, and so that also gives us unique selling points for the different countries and the different activities. And as I mentioned, diversifying across different activities in one place builds resilience and the extensive value chains and multipliers. So the employment opportunities are massive, and that is what we need as part of the development of Africa and the creation of employment and income generation. And if done properly, that's a big caveat, it aligns conservation and development. So not all wildlife economy activities are always aligned with conservation and development, but we need to, as educators, be ensuring that there is this monitoring and evaluation to ensure that. And this will then result in the recognition of wildlife as a key strategic asset and will encourage investment in it. Right now, fauna and flora is seen as a resource, as an input into different things. It is not seen as an asset. And we need to change and shift our whole mindset and the narrative in that wildlife is an asset on the continent of Africa. So we must invest in its conservation to improve development. That is a very brief overview of the wildlife economy because it is so diverse and there are so many opportunities. And essentially, we need to get students thinking more out of the box at how to unlock this potential, how to unlock these opportunities, and to, as I said, see wildlife as an asset, invest in it, grow it, and improve development.
So this was very informative. I'm actually surprised by the fact that, there was hunting banned and that, excluded fishing in Kenya. I guess my first question will be, I saw that we have some Mauritians on the call. Fishing is allowed in some countries. And so what could you say are, or maybe how would you describe the opportunities in fishing other than, buying fish and selling fish to the market? How can Africans who have access to the ocean or some lakes basically trade among each other? Or I don't know, like, how do we grow from just fishing for consumption and probably local sales to bigger and more growth?
Yeah, great question. So what's interesting related to that is that commercial fishing is huge around the whole coastline of Africa. but 25% of commercial fishing around Africa is still done by foreign vessels. And what has happened is that, for example, the European Union and China are the biggest foreign industries fishing around Africa. They negotiate a contract with the country whose ocean or exclusive economic zone it is, which is where you're allowed to fish. And they promise to say 10 billion, but the actual contract is probably worth 100 billion. But because African countries want the income now, they say yes. And so Africa is losing so much from foreign contracts because of wanting to have income now. And so we also need to think long-term, the bigger picture of how we generate these revenues. And obviously a lot of that has to do with, governments changing very quickly. So the government wants the money now. And so we need to think more broadly in a bigger picture. So the commercial fisheries are there. I mean, Namibia has massive commercial fisheries. But as I said earlier, a lot of it is not aligned with conservation objectives because of the way fishing is done. So countries do need to, have better frameworks and better policy and guidelines to align fishing with conservation. So it's not, destroying coral reefs and things like that. But what is interesting in Africa and with all forest products as well as fishing is that we often, as a continent, are selling raw product. We are not adding value to our products. So like fish is being exported raw instead of being salted or dried, where you add value and you can earn more money. The same with, for example, honey, which is massive in Africa, but we are exporting raw honey rather than cleaning the honey, producing honey, bottling it, labeling it, where you could sell it for 5 times more than you can the raw honey. And so the same with fishing. We need to also think of ways to not sell raw fish to create more value that stays in Africa. So there is already quite a lot of inter-Africa trade with countries. As I said, especially in West Africa, some of them, there's a huge consumption. They can't produce enough, so they are importing from other countries within Africa. But aquaculture can also help supply that demand, and aquaculture will create a lot of employment. So help with the development side. I hope that has sufficiently answered your question.
Yes, that was very extensive and detailed. So there is a question: where on the continent do you see leadership in promoting sustainable wildlife economy, and what policy reforms are needed to grow the sector?
Thanks, Casper. Interesting. So as I said, I've been in ALU now for 3 years doing this research, and in the 3 years, there's been an exponential growth in the interest in the wildlife economy. COVID helped because now countries want to diversify. There've also been a lot of international agreements, and the Kigali Call to Action from the Africa Protected Areas Congress, which includes wildlife economy. And those of you familiar, the recent Convention on Biological Diversity, Global Biodiversity Framework, specifically calls on countries to engage in sustainable use, which is the wildlife economy. So South Africa is very advanced. I hesitate to say leader, even though I am South African. South Africa had the Game Theft Act in 1991, which allowed private individuals to own wildlife. There was an exponential increase in wildlife once that was allowed. I mean, it's astounding when people are allowed to own wildlife and benefit from it, how it increased. There was just not great frameworks in place to manage that. And that's why we have problems with canned line hunting, with interbreeding of species. And now all these frameworks are being put in place. So when we are advising governments in West Africa and East Africa, I always say, be careful. South Africa has a huge wildlife economy industry, but look at their policies now and rather learn from their mistakes and integrate it. Tanzania is growing, but yeah, they need better policy and legislation to monitor it. Namibia has quite a good structure, and especially from a benefication from communities benefiting. They have quite sustainable wildlife economy. But yeah, in terms of revenues generated, South Africa definitely one of the largest. Zambia, Zimbabwe, interestingly, all the countries that have given people rights to own and use wildlife. And that's why we need those policy reforms across the continent, because yeah, it's been clearly shown. And so we worked very closely with the Kenyan government, and they have since revised their Wildlife Act, which now needs approval from the new parliamentarians because they just had an election. But essentially that will allow more ownership of wildlife. because the Kenyan government that we were working with was seriously concerned about this fact that they've lost 60% of their wildlife and they are seen as a conservation country. So I think the bottom, very long answer, but there's a lot of interest in the wildlife economy. And I think an institute like the School of Wildlife Conservation providing research and data and sharing learnings across the continent will hopefully help to align policy reform for sustainability.
Thank you. So we have a question. May you kindly explain carbon? I did not quite get what that means. So I guess he's referring to when you said that there is carbon markets as well as part of the main.
How many months do you have? So carbon is very, very complicated, but essentially the ability of soil and trees, mangroves, various other plants to store carbon allows for the creation of carbon credits and the sale of these on a carbon market to earn income. And that is the wildlife economy activity. And so countries that are reforesting, so they are planting and there's now new growth, which means new carbon, can then sell the credits and earn income. It's very complicated. My advice was our State of the Wildlife Economy report, which is on all our publications are open access on the School of Wildlife Conservation. I will try and download it quickly and put it in the chat. In chapter 2 of our main report in 2021, we have an overview of the carbon markets that was written by Christina Enders from Conservation International. And it is still, in my opinion, the best overview of the carbon market that there's, in terms of explain, it is seriously complex. There's also a lot of controversy about it that some of you might have seen in the press recently in terms of offsets. So, for example, a factory in Germany can buy credits in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So they are still polluting in Germany, but they are buying carbon from DRC. And people are saying, well, you need to mitigate your damage in Germany. You can't just, pay another country to take, your carbon. And so there are a lot's happening in the carbon space, but there is a potential for revenue generation from it.
Yeah. We have another question from Jobert, and it's, how is climate change affecting the wildlife economy? And what are the opportunities or threats for students, researchers, and entrepreneurs, basically?
Climate change is a massive risk. Sorry, let me just put this link in the chat here. You can find all our publications on that page. Because climate change impacts the asset base, that stock, because it impacts fauna and flora. And so if we don't manage, and then they are very interlinked, the wildlife economy and climate change, we need to manage climate change to be able to maintain that asset and to keep that stock available. Otherwise, we are going to run out of various things. And obviously, it also climate change impacts on activities. So things like marine and coastal tourism is hugely impacted by climate change. So yeah, it is very much affecting it. The threats and opportunities in that area for students, researchers. Yeah, I mean, doing research on the impacts. So, I mean, if the students are economics, economists, economic modeling of impacts is really important to understand. And then mitigation measures. So how do we mitigate if we know that X is going to happen? How do we mitigate as much as possible? Because a lot of the climate change stuff is going to be mitigation and or adaptation, because it is sadly going to happen. And that's where the carbon space can be very important as part of the mitigation and adaptation tool in terms of helping to combat climate change a little bit.
Thank you so much. That's all the questions that we had. And thank you for sharing the link to all the publications. I guess in my personal and biased opinions, if you want to get started, start from the closest country to you, or maybe to your country if there is any research on your country. And you can start from reading from the link that we just shared in the chat box. Otherwise, this has been a very informative session, and we're very, very glad to have hosted you guys and to have share this knowledge with you guys. Thank you so much, Sue. Do you have something else to add as well?
No, but happy to chat to anyone. I'm on LinkedIn, Sue Snyman, if anyone wants to connect, very happy to connect. As I said, we have this African wildlife economy community of practice. Let me know if you'd like to join. We haven't actually officially launched it. We just have a steering committee at the moment, but we will be launching it within the next month. And yeah, on that, the idea is to share research gaps and knowledge and really unlock this as a growth opportunity for youth, because ultimately, if we can conserve wildlife now, it will be there for them in the future, and they won't have to be rewilding. They'll still be able to rely on it for development. And so, yeah, it's a win-win for me.
Yes. Oh, there is another question from Dr. Mehdi. He's asking, from your experience, is there a way really to integrate this concept in an educational program?
Absolutely. I think it should be integrated, because we so often teach conservation and development as separate. And for me, the youth in Africa need to understand that they are not mutually exclusive. And we need to really, and in fact, if any of you are going to be in Kigali at the 1st of June, I will be doing a TEDx talk at TEDx ALU Rwanda on what if we change the narrative about conservation. And so I think as educators, we need to be changing the narrative. That also conservation is often seen as a colonial pastime, not something for Africans to get involved in. And Africans need to become very involved in conservation, because it is their future. And so getting students to understand, and I'm always so excited with our students at ALU. I had a student recently from Cote d'Ivoire, and she said, she learned nothing about conservation in Cote d'Ivoire when she was growing up. And now she just wants to go back and tell everyone and change everyone's minds, at how important it is. And so, just changing that mindset about how important it is for every single one of us' health, our future, our food, everything, and for the development of the continent. So I think absolutely it can and should be integrated through either economics, because you can, as I said, the wildlife economy, or through development, or through conservation. So many different angles to bring it in.
That's all we have for today. I hope everybody's questions have been answered. We'll be sharing this conversation again in the emails that are going to come after. Thank you so much again for joining us, and thank you so much, Sue, for taking your time and sharing all this knowledge with all of us.
Thanks. Thank you, Anik. Thank you, everyone.